Hi fanatics, welcome to Murder, Mystery and Kit Up Sunday. Ta-da! That's what we're going to call this now. I'm just going to talk over my kitten up because my kitten ups are generally, this is a skin tone 950. They're normally pretty boring. So I'm going to do a true crime over the top of my kitten up videos, unless I have something specific to chat about. But I'm going to do my whipping chats while I'm actually whipping on a project. So I'm kitting up Geisha. I've checked, and I don't actually show you the image because I didn't have the sticker sheet, so I kind of couldn't show you the image. But I'll put a completed image on the end because, again, I found an old kitten up video on my phone, so I thought I'd do a true crime over the top of it. So I hope you're good. I hope you're diamond painting or crafting along with me, whatever your craft is of choice. And we're going to dive into a true crime. Now, I always do, what is the word? A warning, it can be graphic, it's true crime. But this one does involve the death of children, which I know is not for everyone. So I'm just putting it out there that there is a despicable human being out there who murders children. So that is today's true crime. I just want to put that out there in case this one's not for you. I totally understand. I did delve into this one, and it's not good. None of them are. None of my true crime are. And I say this all the time. I even get emotional doing these true crimes because it happens to real people. It's not just a story. And I always like to pay homage to the families that are impacted by the heartless actions of others. So let's dive in, okay? And we'll have a chat after the fact. I've zoomed in super close for a very good reason. My pizza arrived while I was getting up, and I didn't want you sitting there looking at my pizza, getting envious. So I am zoomed in super close, I'm sorry. But hopefully you're diamond painting or crafting along with me, not necessarily watching me kit up. But if you are, sorry, you got a super, super close view there. Okay, let's begin. Okay, you have a project, you have a drink. Let's dive into today's true crime. This is seedy from the get-go. I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to talk about some things because this kind of resonated with me a little bit. And you'll see why. Like, in the light of humour of things before we get too deep in. Okay. Sorry, I will get to it. Paul Boehm had been working as a bus driver in St. Louis, Missouri. We are in Missouri today. When he met 18-year-old Ellen Booker. Although he was married, his marriage was crumbling quickly. Ellen was young enough to be his daughter, but the attraction was too much for him to resist. I'm just putting it out there. There's a word for people like this. Okay? Ellen, too, felt an instant attraction, despite Paul's age and marital status. She was at least 100 pounds overweight, and Paul had been the first man to show any interest at all. Growing up, Ellen had barely known her father. We kind of got the gist of that from the interaction above. He had been emotionally and physically abusive, a heavy drinker, and had a short temper. It was probably a good thing that he was barely ever home. When she was still a young girl, her father left her mother just as he had abandoned his previous wife and 7 children. But when he died of cancer in 1979, Ellen inherited 1/8 of the family farm and sold her share to her stepbrother. By the spring of 1978, Paul's first marriage had ended. 2 years later, he married Ellen. Using her inheritance, of course, and his veterans' benefits, they purchased the home they had been renting on Wyoming Street in St. Louis. A few months after moving in, Ellen's mother, Christine, lost her job, and Paul offered to let her move into the basement of their home. He assumed Ellen would like the idea of her mother being so close, but he was wrong. Ellen had worked hard to create a life on her own and didn't want her mother so close. However, she realised that having Christine would come in handy as they planned to create a family. The family came quickly. Their daughter Jessica was born in September 1981. 4 years later, Stephen was born. Immediately after she gave birth to Stephen, she became pregnant again with their second son, David. Even before she had met Paul, Ellen had developed an obsession with professional wrestling. Not the kind of wrestling you see in the Olympics, but the theatrical choreographed wrestling featuring muscled men with names like Brutus Beefcake, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Hulk Hogan. Now, this is where I identify. If you know me at all, you will know I love my wrestling. I'm a bigger fan of AEW and the likes of Jeff Hardy, Shawn Michaels, Jericho, much more modern than Macho Man and Hulk Hogan. But I kind of thought, I like her. We would get on in this part of her life. Initially, Paul attended the wrestling matches with Ellen, but couldn't quite understand her strange fixation on the silly sport. And again, this resonated because my dear old friend Travis, I'm pretty sure he thinks that it's a silly sport, but I love it, and he's happy that I have found something that I love, is what he says. That's his exact words to me. Okay, so this is where the similarities between me and Ellen end, okay? Just the wrestling. I get it. I mean, I'm not as obsessed as she is, but I do love it. I can't wait till August. When they come to the UK, I'm going to go. Right. It was a relief for him when Ellen met Deanne Smith. Deanne was an extreme fan of professional wrestling as well. The two were peas in a pod. The two started attending matches together, often travelling overnight just to see their favourite wrestlers. This arrangement was fine with Paul, who would rather spend his time and money drinking in bars. Just a quick question. Well, I'm assuming Christine moved in and Ellen's mum, is looking after the children at this point. Ellen had returned from an overnight wrestling trip with Deanne just in time for her and Paul's 6th wedding anniversary, when Paul gave her some bad news. During this time in Vietnam, he had been exposed to Agent Orange, and it's kind of like a welfare chemical that was later revealed to cause major health problems for those that had been exposed to it. So as a result, he often broke out in rashes all over his body, and he told Ellen that the military would cover his treatment, but he would need to go to Texas to stay in a military hospital under the serious treatment. And he would have to quit his job because the treatment could take several months. And Ellen, at this point, is 8 months pregnant with David. And he leaves for Texas. He goes. Now, Deanne was going through a difficult divorce at the time, and she thought it was really odd that Paul's doctors hadn't consulted with Ellen at all. And because the treatment was so major, you'd kind of need the support system in place, She found that very odd that she wasn't involved in any of it. And it sounded very suspicious. So she said to Ellen, why don't you drive to the hospital? You don't have to go in, just see if you can see his car in the car park. Because obviously that's where he's staying. His car should be there. And Ellen thought, don't be silly. It's fine. Don't worry about it. He's not going to leave me a month before the baby is coming. And stop being silly. But after a few weeks, she hadn't heard from Paul at all. So she took Deanne's advice and she drove down to the hospital. And guess what? His car wasn't there. So Ellen was still in denial that her husband had left. But a former co-worker then confirmed that Paul had been having an affair with a young girl named Terry. Then she knew her marriage was over, and the fact that they've gone young girl again, it's alarm bells, isn't it? These people have a type, and a certain age limit generally is their pattern. So her son David was born in the summer of 1986, and Paul showed up at the maternity ward, and he played the proud, doting father, and he held David in his arms and posed for photos, and that would be the only time he ever saw his son. He got back in his car and he drove off. He moved to Dodge City in Texas with his new girlfriend, Terry. Ellen and Paul were divorced not long afterwards, and he married Terry. And no doubt Terry knows what's coming, as we all do. But she doesn't know that, but we all know what's going to happen with Terry. He's going to get her pregnant and leave her too. Because he's such a nice catch. So Paul was on his third wife and had left Ellen in the same way that he'd left his previous wife. Ironically, it was the same way that Ellen's own dad abandoned his two families. He did the exact same thing, and turned out Paul was no different. After her divorce, Ellen immersed herself in professional wrestling. She and Deanne often travelled for long weekends to out-of-town events, sometimes following the wrestlers from town to town to watch the same shows every night. Ellen had an active imagination. She often told friends and co-workers that she was having romantic relationships with these wrestlers, and she developed an obsession with one wrestler in particular. And his name is, forgive me if I say this wrong, but Ted Diabasi. He is the $1 Million Man. Every chance she got, she would desperately try to speak to the $1 Million Man. She yelled to him as he walked down the aisle towards the ring on event nights, and she waited in the hotel bars where he stayed, hoping for a chance to flirt with him. She tried to flirt with many of the wrestlers, but at well over £300, none of them were interested in her. She threw herself at them, only to be rejected each time. The rejection, however, didn't keep her from fantasising. I mean, we all need our dreams, right? But she's taking it a little too far. She made up stories of torrid love affairs that she regularly shared with her friends. In Ellen's mind, the men couldn't resist her when the truth was they wanted nothing to do with her. Ellen's obsession with wrestling was an unhealthy escape from reality. And I get that. I do get that. You know, mental health is no picnic. And her way of coping, rather than focusing on her children for some reason, she's immersed herself in wrestling. Ellen worked a data entry job at an accounting firm, but it wasn't enough to make ends meet. She took a second job, 4 nights a week, delivering pizza in order to feed her kids and still be able to travel to the wrestling matches. Despite the extra job, however, it still wasn't enough, and the bank foreclosed on the house that she had purchased with Paul. Ellen and her 3 kids moved into the Riverbend City apartments along the banks of the Mississippi River. Although she couldn't afford to pay her mortgage, she always found a few $100s to spend every weekend on wrestling matches. See, that's insane to me. Like, my kids come first. Ellen and Paul's divorce decree stated that Paul was obligated to pay monthly child support for his 3 children. But guess what? Being the stand-up guy, he never paid a dime. Still unable to pay the bills, she filed for bankruptcy in September 1987. Although it paid off all her debts, her paychecks were being garnished and she was unable to pay her utilities. Thanksgiving 1988 was busy for Ellen. After having a traditional Thanksgiving meal, she drove her 3 children into downtown St. Louis to see the department store window displays that had been decorated for Christmas. 2-year-old David grew tired through the day and slept in the back of the car as she drove home. But by the time they arrived home that evening, just after 9 p.m, David was wide awake and he'd got his second wind and wanted to watch TV. It was Ellen's night to watch her favourite show, Knots Landing, and David wanted to watch too. This is where we take a turn, okay? So Ellen sat on the sofa and David laid on the floor with a pillow to watch the show. It's unclear what is going through Ellen's mind as she watched the show. Perhaps she contemplated the frustration she felt by raising 3 kids on her own, or having Thanksgiving dinner without the love and support of a husband. Ellen moved from the couch and knelt on the floor, just behind David. As the boy watched TV, she pulled a cushion from the couch, moved the boy onto his back, and placed a cushion over his face. She put her weight, and bearing in mind she's heavy, onto the edges of the cushion and held it tight across his face until his kicking and resistance stopped. Now, did she immediately regret her actions, call 911 and get the paramedics out? No, she sat back down on the sofa while David lay unresponsive on the floor. His lips had turned a pale shade of blue. She calmly picked up the phone. 911? Nope. She called her friend Sandy, a friend she had known since high school. Ellen made small talk with Sandy and the two women discussed their Thanksgiving holiday. All the while, David lay at her feet, motionless. After 15 minutes of casual conversation, Ellen suddenly cut Sandy off. She told her that her son David was laying on the floor and he had just stopped breathing and he was turning blue, and I've got to go. I've got to call 911. Several minutes later, paramedics arrived and pounded on the door. There was no answer. They pounded again. Still nothing. Several minutes had passed when Jessica, that's the eldest daughter, answered the door and explained that her mother had gone downstairs. The paramedics entered the apartment to find David unresponsive on the floor. He was in cardiac arrest. Their initial attempts to revive him were unsuccessful, and they prepared him for the ambulance. After 10 minutes, Ellen appeared. She told the emergency team that she had gone downstairs to find help. She seemed strangely calm and explained that David had been sick earlier in the day. Paramedics offered her a ride in the ambulance with her son, but she declined. She said she would just meet them at the hospital. When the paramedics left the apartment with David, Ellen called Sandy back and asked if she could watch the kids for the evening while she went to the hospital. While David arrived at the emergency room, doctors were unable to resuscitate him and they placed him on life support. His body temperature reached 101 degrees and doctors used ice to keep the temperature down. That evening, doctors thought it was strange that Ellen didn't stay by David's bedside throughout the night. Instead, she informed hospital staff that she would go back home, get some sleep, and return in the morning. The next morning, just after 9 a.m, Ellen returned to the hospital and she told the nurses that she had, quote, a good night's sleep, end quote. David's condition had not changed. From the hospital, Ellen called Deanne to tell her what had happened. Deanne rushed to the hospital to be by the side of her friend in her time of need. But she noticed Ellen didn't seem upset at all. Deanne was showing more emotion than Ellen. She assumed Ellen must have been up all night at David's bedside and was just in a state of shock and exhaustion. After lunch, Ellen told Deanne that she was going to go and take a nap in the waiting room. And Deanne thought, that's a good idea. She didn't know that she had gone home for a full night's sleep. So while she slept, Deanne sat by David's bedside, rubbing his cold legs. Deanne sat with David into the late evening, and she woke Ellen at 11 p.m. and she was still asleep in the waiting room. She had slept the entire day. David's doctors had finished a brain scan, but his brain was showing no activity at all. Late that night, as they drove home, Deanne noted that Ellen still didn't seem to be that upset about David's condition, and she said, quote, "You must have been exhausted having stayed up all night with David," end quote. She was astonished to hear Ellen admit that she had gone home and slept the night before. Deanne stayed with Ellen that night. In the morning, Deanne called the hospital, but the news wasn't good. David had shown no signs of recovery. When they arrived back at the hospital, Ellen lifted David's eyelids, looking for any reaction at all. Nothing. That afternoon, doctors performed one last brain scan, but there was no change. David was not coming back. Although he was technically still alive, he was only being kept alive by the machines. Doctors told Ellen that without the life support machines, David would live for less than an hour. With no show of emotion, Ellen plainly told doctors, "Pull it," giving her consent to remove David's life support. The doctors had never seen a parent with such detachment. Deanne noticed a slight smirk on Ellen's face that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Doctors pronounced David at 3:40 p.m. on November the 26th, 1988. Ellen sat in a rocking chair in the hospital room, holding David's body just after his death. She rocked back and forth a few times and said, "Mummy loves you." But Deanne was troubled by the insincerity of her tone. The medical examiner determined David had died of sudden infant death syndrome. It's also known as cot death. Normally only occurred in infants less than a year old. David, however, was 28 months. It was almost unheard of for a child of that age to die of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. I'm just going to interject here because I've gone through this myself. And we rushed Katie to the hospital, and then we were told nothing could be done. And I remember just going into shock. I didn't hear a word the doctors said. I just kind of spaced out, I guess. I can't explain it. It was shock. It was shock. But we had a police liaison officer. We had a police liaison officer come home with us, and they kept coming to me saying, "Can we take the blanket? Can we take the pillowcases? Can we take this? Can we take the milk?" And they were looking for signs of foul play. And I just said, "Can you please just stop asking me? Take whatever you need. You don't have to ask me for every item. Just, I knew I did nothing wrong." So how did this not happen here? How come it was just... I mean, Katie was 20 days old. So they say that it happens in less than 1 year old, yet David was 28 months and nothing was being asked. Or maybe the protocol is different now because this is 1988, right? Maybe it's just different. But it's really... It just hit home. I'm sorry, this is not about me. I'm good. I'm fine. It's just a bit close to home, and I'm just asking why they were not looking at things more sinisterly. You know, it was almost unheard of for a child of that age to pass away from sudden infant death syndrome. Anyway, sorry, let's get back to it. Poor David. It's about David, right? The day after David's death, Ellen arranged his funeral, then bought tickets. Oh my gosh. See, again, she bought tickets to the next wrestling show. Deanne suspected it was her odd way of coping with the loss. And again, coming back, I remember I used to live close to town and I could walk into town. And it had been a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months, and Carl at the time was in pull-up nappies and we'd run out. So I walked into town. I was going to get pull-up nappies and come home. I was in no fit state to do very much. And I bumped into one of the mums that I knew from the mother and baby group. And she was like, "Oh, where's your baby?" And I was like, she's passed away. And she was like, "Oh my God, if my child had passed away, I wouldn't be out walking around town." I grabbed my nappies and I got back, and I remember sat with my mum, and my mum went, "How do you know? How does she know? How does she know how she would cope?" Yeah, she was trying to eliminate that, but it stuck with me. And I wasn't walking around looking for a new handbag. I was getting my other child nappies. Yeah, no. Anyway, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be talking about my story in between this. It's just I can relate, and there's no way I could have done anything. I couldn't have even watched wrestling on TV, let alone actually book tickets to go see the next. It's so maddening. Okay, so do you remember Paul, the dad? Yeah. He found out that David had passed. Not from Helen, but from his mother-in-law, aka her mum. When he called Ellen, she complained that she couldn't afford a funeral for David. As a veteran, Paul suggested she use his veteran benefits for a no-charge burial at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, but Ellen wouldn't hear any of it. She wanted him to pay for a proper funeral. David was buried at the Trinity Cemetery, friends and co-workers in attendance, and it was one of the saddest days they've ever experienced. Deanne was so distraught over the death and couldn't get herself to attend. Ellen, however, seemed cold and calm at the funeral, baffling others at her total lack of emotion. Paul was upset that Ellen had not buried David using his veterans' benefits, but he really had no say in the matter because he'd seen him once and held him for 5 seconds for a photo op and completely disappeared out of his life. Ellen's co-workers held a collection to raise money for her, knowing that she was working 2 jobs, got no support from Paul, and had to pay for the funeral herself. Again, worked very differently for me, but, you know. Ellen held a $5,000 life insurance policy on each child provided by her employer. However, despite the $5,000 and another $1,000 raised by her co-workers, she refused to pay the $2,348 funeral bill. Do you know what she did instead? No, it's not wrestling. She needs to get to the wrestling, so she bought herself a new car. After David's death, Ellen's life returned to normal, apparently. Mine's still not normal, but hers returned to normal pretty quickly. She got regular manicures and continued attending wrestling matches. According to those around her, she almost seemed more upbeat than before. One would think that having just lost a child, Ellen would be protective of her surviving children. Yeah, that's a very genuine thing. Her actions showed exactly the opposite. She enlisted her mother to watch her kids while she went on her wrestling trips, often not calling to check on them at all. During August 1989, Ellen began calling insurance companies to get quotes for additional policies on Jennifer and Stephen, her remaining children. She already had policies for $5,000 each from her employer, but she wanted more. She purchased several policies until each child was insured for $100,000. Ellen wasn't able to pay for her phone bill, which was inevitably disconnected, but she found the money for insurance policies, wrestling matches, and manicures. September the 13th, 1989. Was like any other day in their household. Ellen came home from work, cleaned the house, made dinner, and that night, after tucking Stephen into bed and reading him a story, Jennifer brought her Barbie dolls into the bathroom to take a bath before going to bed. Jennifer was unaware that her mother watched from the hallway while she washed herself and her dolls. As Jennifer rinsed her face, her hair, Ellen plugged a hairdryer into the wall socket in the hallway and silently tossed it into Jennifer's bath water. The electricity coursed through Jennifer's body as she frantically tried to get out the tub. With her eyes closed, she had no idea what was going on or where the pain was coming from. She only knew she had to get out of the tub. Jennifer's screams woke Stephen, who ran towards the bathroom, where, when she saw Stephen, Ellen unplugged the hairdryer and calmly asked her daughter, "How did that dryer get into the tub?" A small bit of blood came out of the corner of Jennifer's mouth as she unsuccessfully tried to speak. Ellen told her to get dressed and they would go to the emergency room. Both kids were screaming and Ellen went down to the hall to the apartment of a friend who was a medical student. He wasn't home. However, Jennifer and Stephen's screams had attracted the attention of neighbours who called the police. As Ellen and the kids stood outside of the building waiting for the police to arrive, Ellen made sure that the two of them had their story straight. Ellen told the children that Stephen had woken up, saw that Jennifer had washed the Barbie doll's hair and thought that they needed to have their hair dried, so he plugged the hairdryer in and accidentally dropped it in the tub. Jennifer protested, knowing it was a lie. Stephen had been asleep when it happened and was nowhere near the bathroom. Once at the emergency room, Jennifer reluctantly repeated the lie that it was all Stephen's fault. After an examination, doctors noticed her pupils were dilated and that she had hemorrhages on her tongue, but otherwise she was okay and released. 9 days later, Friday, September the 9th, was Stephen's 4th birthday. The following day, Ellen brought him in for a scheduled doctor visit to get his DTaP and oral polio vaccines. The doctor gave him a clean bill of health, but said that the injection, the vaccine, might give him a mild fever and might make him a little sick. According to Ellen, Stephen couldn't eat for the rest of the day and vomited that evening. The following day, Sunday, she said he wasn't quite feeling... She said he wasn't feeling much better, slept most of the day, and she fed him only liquids. On Monday morning, Ellen planned to stay home from work to take care of Stephen, claiming he was still feeling the side effects of the vaccines. After sending Jennifer off to school, Ellen took Stephen to her mother's house for a quick visit. After leaving her mother's apartment, Ellen stopped by a payphone to call work. At 8:15 a.m, she told them she was taking Stephen to the hospital, saying, "The same thing that happened to David is happening to Stephen." But that was a lie. As they drove towards their apartment, they passed the funeral home where David's funeral had been held. Stephen told his mother, "I want to see David," and cried. She drove him to the cemetery so he could visit his brother's grave. At 11:30 a.m, Ellen stopped at payphone again to call her work. This time, she claimed they were going back to the hospital a second time. She told her employer that the first time they couldn't find anything wrong with him, but then he had stopped breathing again. After the call, Ellen drove Stephen back to their apartment, where he sat in front of the television and watched Sesame Street while she cleaned the house. That afternoon, Stephen fell asleep in front of the TV. Again, Ellen knelt on the floor next to her son, took the pillow from under his head and smothered him. Ellen ran out of her apartment and past the medical student's door. She went up the elevator to the 8th floor to her friend Pauline's apartment, but she was on the wrong floor. Pauline lived on the 6th floor. Ellen then took the elevator back down to her own apartment and knocked on the door of Todd, the medical student, who immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived at 12:29 p.m. to find Stephen unresponsive on the floor. She told him he was watching television and suddenly stopped breathing. Paramedics rushed Stephen to the hospital, and again Ellen refused to ride in the ambulance, preferring to drive herself. The ambulance arrived at the hospital at 1:24 p.m. Ellen drove to her mother's house first and didn't arrive at the hospital until well after 2 p.m. From the hospital, Ellen called Deanne and left a message at her work saying, Quote, "The same thing that happened to David happened to Stephen. He died sometime during the middle of the night." End quote. At 4 p.m, Ellen called her work again to tell her co-workers that doctors were considering taking Stephen off of life support. But the truth was, Stephen had been pronounced dead 15 minutes earlier. Ellen couldn't seem to keep her story straight. She gave everyone she spoke to a slightly different version. Her stories got more convoluted when her co-workers came to the hospital to console her and she wasn't wearing her work clothes. She had specifically told them she had taken Stephen to the hospital after she was dressed for work. Ellen, again, seemed stoic at the death of her son. She spoke matter-of-factly about his death and that they had donated his eyes after his death. Just minutes after her son's death, Ellen spoke to a friend in the hospital waiting room and noticed two young, handsome men, as if she had completely forgotten what had just happened. Ellen pointed to the men and said, quote, "I don't know what to do. Both of those men want to go out with me. They work at my office." End quote. Deanne was confused and suspicious of Ellen's stories. She had been told that Stephen died in the middle of the night, not that afternoon. Deanne was the first to notice that Ellen's stories made little sense and were a little too convenient. Nobody loses two children to sudden infant death syndrome, particularly not within a year of each other. I don't know facts and figures. I can neither confirm or deny that, but I should imagine it's unlikely because when Reese was born, obviously after Katie, extra measures were put in place and I was given, gadgets to like have near him that would alarm sound if his breathing was irregular or something. So I kind of think that's unlikely. Deanne called a friend that was a police sergeant and he put her in touch with a homicide detective. Doctors tested Ellen and Jennifer for genetic cardiac issues and abnormal heart arrhythmia, but both checked out fine. The medical examiner that examined Stephen's body had ruled out all possible causes of death except for drugs, drowning, or mechanical asphyxia. When the toxicology report came back negative, the medical examiner sent his findings to 7 respected medical experts for their opinions. Every expert ruled out any cause of death other than mechanical asphyxia. After learning the cause of death, police became concerned for Jennifer's safety and contacted Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services questioned Jennifer and she initially gave Ellen's made-up version of the bathtub incident. Eventually, however, she broke down and told the truth. She admitted that her mother had instructed her to blame it on Stephen. He was actually asleep when the hairdryer fell into the tub. Investigators began talking to Ellen's friends, neighbours, co-workers. Through various interviews, detectives learned that the additional life insurance purchases and the inconsistent stories from the day of Stephen's death. In early 1991, police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Ellen. FBI assisted local law enforcement in the arrest, and she was pulled over as she drove home from work. In the interrogation room, detectives spread out reams of paper on the table and placed elaborate charts on the walls, the information all pertaining to her finances, insurance policies, and the children's medical records. Within minutes, Ellen confessed. Displaying very little emotion or remorse, Ellen explained to detectives that she had been overwhelmed with debt, getting no financial support from Paul, and felt she had no choice but to murder her children. To avoid the death penalty, 32-year-old Ellen pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Custody of his surviving daughter Jennifer was not awarded to Paul. At 8 years old, she was handed over to the Missouri Department of Social Services. And that makes me extremely sad. The girl went into care. That's very sad. I don't know why the mum didn't take her, or why Paul didn't step up and do it for his daughter after she attempted to electrocute her, essentially, in the bathtub. Oh my gosh. I hope Jennifer is happy and doing well, and yeah, I really do. I mean, this is going from one tragedy to the next. It all started with an abusive father, and her self-esteem was very, very low. That I can identify with. Then you take in wasters, that I can identify with, and so on and so forth. So very, very, very tragic. So very tragic. I don't know how a mother can do that to her own children. I really can't. It's shocking. It is absolutely shocking. Please do, if you made it through today's true crime, hats off to you. I struggled, and obviously shared personal things in there as well. But yeah, oh my gosh. Please do leave your thoughts and comments down below. Oh God, she's the stuff of nightmares, isn't she? Oh, okay. Thank you for joining me. Yeah, I know some of these are really, really hard to listen to. I know you struggled with the case the other week. He was lurking at the bottom of the bed of this old couple. His name escapes me. Yeah. But thank you for joining me on today's true crime. I do appreciate it. I know some of these are extremely heavy, but I like to bring awareness. I'm not sure how old Stephen was. I didn't do the math, but David and Stephen's life were taken by their own mother. Yeah. So, you know, they are in my heart too. Very, very tragic. I don't think it was a burden. I think she got all her priorities wrong. But hey, there you go. Yeah, as always, leave your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you tomorrow, Monday Night Live. Yeah, Monday Night Live. And next week, if you're just here for the true crime, oh wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. And please, 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 go hug your kids. Show them lots of love. And stay safe out there. See you later.